The alien girl had no legs and the human had no friends. The stench of desperation hung thick in the air as Dax trudged through the grimy streets of the forgotten planet. This shithole was a haven for the galaxy's dregs, and he fit right in. An ex-soldier with a rap sheet longer than his arm, Dax survived on the fringes, taking on jobs that others wouldn't touch. It was a lonely existence, but he preferred it that way. Attachments were a liability he couldn't afford. As he turned into a narrow alley, a flicker of movement caught his eye. Instinctively, his hand went to his blaster. In this place, you shot first and asked questions later. But instead of a threat, he found a small, blue-skinned alien girl huddled against the wall. She had no legs, just a ragged dress covering her lower half. Dax had seen some shit in his life, but this was a new level of fucked up. The girl glared up at him with defiant, silver eyes. "What do you want, human?" she spat, trying to sound tough. But Dax could see right through it. He recognized that look, the look of someone who'd been through hell and was barely hanging on. "Just passing through," Dax grunted. "What's a kid like you doing in a place like this?" "None of your damn business," she retorted, but her voice wavered. "I can take care of myself," Dax snorted. "Yeah, I can see that." He should walk away, leave her to her fate. He had his own problems to deal with. But something about this girl, the fire in her eyes despite her broken body, struck a chord deep within him. He took a closer look at her, noting the dirt and grime caked on her skin, the matted tangles in her white hair. She was a fighter, that much was clear, but even fighters needed a helping hand sometimes. Dax knew that better than anyone. "When's the last time you ate?" he asked gruffly. Treya's stomach answered for her, growling loudly in the silence of the alley. She wrapped her arms around her middle, glaring at Dax as if daring him to comment. Dax sighed. "Look, kid, I ain't no saint, but I've got some food back at my place. You're welcome to it if you want." Treya's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "What's the catch?" "No catch. Just don't expect me to make a habit of it." She considered him for a long moment, weighing her options. Finally, she nodded. "Fine, but try anything funny and I'll bite your fucking nose off." Dax barked out a laugh. "Duly noted." He crouched down, offering his back to her. "Climb on." Treya hesitated briefly before clambering onto his back, her small arms wrapping around his neck. Dax stood, adjusting his grip on her legs. She was light as a feather, but he could feel the tension thrumming through her body. As he navigated the winding streets back to his tiny, run-down apartment, Dax couldn't help but wonder what the hell he was doing. He wasn't the type to get involved. Life had taught him the hard way that caring about others only led to pain. But there was something about Treya, a kinship he couldn't quite define. They were both survivors, clinging to life in a galaxy that had chewed them up and spit them out. Reaching his building, Dax climbed the rickety stairs to the top floor, ignoring the curious stares from his neighbors. They knew better than to ask questions. He shouldered open the door to his apartment, depositing Treya gently on the threadbare couch. "Wait here," he said, moving to the small kitchen. He rummaged through the cupboards, pulling out a can of soup and a slightly stale loaf of bread. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. As he heated the soup on the ancient stove, Dax glanced over at Treya. She was huddled on the couch, her eyes darting around the room warily, like a cornered animal, ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. "Relax, kid," Dax said, setting a bowl of steaming soup and a hunk of bread on the coffee table in front of her. "If I wanted to hurt you, I would have done it already." Treya eyed the food hungrily, but made no move to take it. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. Dax shrugged, settling into the armchair across from her. "Hell if I know. Maybe I'm just tired of living in a universe where kids like you get dealt such a shit hand." A flicker of surprise crossed Treya's face, followed by a faint, tentative smile. She reached for the bowl, cradling it in her hands as she slurped the soup greedily. Dax watched her, feeling a strange warmth in his chest. It had been a long time since he'd had anyone to care for, anyone to protect. As Treya finished her meal, her eyelids began to droop. Exhaustion was clearly catching up with her. Dax stood, grabbing a blanket from the back of the couch and draping it over her small form. "Get some rest," he said gruffly. "We'll figure out what to do with you in the morning." Treya mumbled something unintelligible, already drifting off to sleep. Dax watched her for a moment, marveling at the trust she'd placed in him, a complete stranger. It was a trust he wasn't sure he deserved, but one he found himself wanting to live up to. As he settled back into his chair, Dax's mind raced with questions. Who was this girl? What had happened to her? And why did he feel such a strong urge to protect her? He had a feeling that the answers would lead them both down a dangerous path. But for the first time in a long time, Dax found himself ready to face whatever the universe had in store. He wasn't alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The first rays of the planet's twin suns crept through the cracks in the window shutters, casting a warm glow over Treya's sleeping form. Dax watched her from his chair, a forgotten cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. He'd barely slept, his mind too busy trying to make sense of the events that had led this strange, legless alien girl into his life. A soft whimper escaped Treya's lips, her brow furrowing as she twitched in her sleep. Dax recognized the signs of a nightmare all too well. Setting his mug aside, he moved to the couch, gently shaking her shoulder. "Hey kid, wake up, it's just a dream." Treya's eyes snapped open, wide and panicked. She scrambled to sit up, nearly tumbling off the couch in her haste. Dax caught her, his hands steadying her shoulders. "Easy there, Treya. You're safe. It's okay." She stared at him, chest heaving, as she tried to calm her breathing. I saw them again. The ones who killed my mother. They were coming for me." Dax's heart clenched. He knew the pain of losing a parent, the fear of being hunted. "They can't hurt you here. I won't let them." Treya's lower lip trembled, tears welling in her silver eyes. "Why do you care? You don't even know me." "You're right, I don't. But I know what it's like to be alone, to feel like the whole damn universe is against you. No one should have to face that, especially not a kid." A single tear rolled down Treya's cheek, leaving a clean trail through the grime. "I'm not a kid. I'm 12 cycles old," Dax chuckled. "My bad. You're practically an old lady." Treya cracked a small smile, wiping at her face with the back of her hand. "You're weird for a human. I'll take that as a compliment." Dax stood, stretching the kinks out of his back. "Now how about some breakfast? I make a mean pot of shitty coffee." As Dax busied himself in the kitchen, Treya watched him, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Dax?" she called out. "What happened to your friends?" He froze, hand hovering over the coffee pot. "What makes you think I had any? Everyone has friends, or at least they should." Dax sighed, pouring 2 mugs of the steaming, tar-like liquid. He carried them over to the couch, handing one to Treya. "I used to, back when I was a soldier. But war has a way of taking things from you. People you care about, pieces of yourself. After a while, it just seemed easier to go it alone." Treya sipped at her coffee, her nose wrinkling at the bitter taste. "Sounds lonely. It is what it is." Dax shrugged, but there was a heaviness to the gesture. "Anyway, enough about me. We need to figure out what to do with you." "What do you mean?" "Well, you can't exactly stay here forever. As much as I enjoy the company, this place isn't fit for a kid. Or an old lady in your case." Treya's grip tightened on her mug, her knuckles turning pale blue. "I don't have anywhere else to go. The people who killed my mother, they'll find me. They always do." Dax leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "Who are they, Treya? And why are they after you?" She hesitated, worrying at her lower lip with sharp teeth. "They're called the Crimson Fangs. They're a gang, or at least they used to be. Now they're more like an army. They control half the planet, and they're always looking for new recruits, especially ones with abilities." "Abilities? What kind of abilities?" Treya set her mug down, her hands twisting in her lap. "I can do things, Dax. Things I can't always control. My mother, she could do them too. That's why they wanted her, why they killed her when she refused to join them." Dax's mind raced, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. A gang with an interest in powered individuals. A mother murdered for her defiance. A child left to fend for herself on the streets. It was a story he'd heard before, in a dozen different variations. The strong preying on the weak, the innocent caught in the crossfire. He reached out, covering Treya's restless hands with his own. "Listen to me, kid. I don't care what kind of abilities you have. I'm not going to let the Crimson Fangs or anyone else hurt you. We'll figure this out together, okay?" Treya looked up at him, her eyes shining with a fragile hope. "You promise?" "I promise. Now, how about we go see a friend of mine? He's a bit of a mad scientist, but he owes me a favor. Maybe he can help us out with your mobility issues." A grin spread across Treya's face, bright and genuine. "You mean like robot legs? That would be so cool." Dax laughed, the sound rusty from disuse. "Yeah, kid, like robot legs. Now finish your coffee and let's get moving. The sooner we get you back on your feet, the sooner we can start figuring out how to keep you safe." As they set out into the bustling streets, Treya perched on Dax's back like a tiny chattering backpack. He couldn't help but feel a spark of something he'd thought long extinguished. Purpose, maybe. Or perhaps just the simple joy of having someone to care for, to protect. He knew the road ahead would be far from easy. The Crimson Fangs were not an enemy to be taken lightly, and Treya's abilities were sure to draw unwanted attention. But for the first time in years, Dax found himself looking forward to the challenge. After all, he wasn't alone anymore. He had a friend, and that was worth fighting for. The streets of the city were a labyrinth of neon signs and seedy alleyways, the perfect hiding place for those who didn't want to be found. Dax navigated them with the ease of a man who knew every shortcut and back door, Treya clinging tightly to his shoulders as they wove through the crowds. "Are we there yet?" Treya asked, her voice muffled against Dax's neck. "Almost, kid. Just a couple more blocks." True to his word, Dax soon came to a stop in front of a dilapidated building. Its walls covered in graffiti and its windows boarded up. He rapped his knuckles against the metal door, a complex pattern that seemed to echo through the empty street. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of rusted hinges, the door swung open, revealing a dimly lit hallway and a figure shrouded in shadow. Well, 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 if it isn't Dax the Axe, darkening my doorstep once again. Dax rolled his eyes. "Nice to see you too, Doc. Mind if we come in?" The figure stepped aside, motioning them forward with a sweep of his arm. But of course, mi casa es su casa, as they say. As they entered the building, Treya's eyes widened in wonder. The interior was a stark contrast to the derelict exterior, all gleaming metal and blinking lights. Every surface was cluttered with gadgets and gizmos, wires snaking across the floor like mechanical vines. "Whoa," Treya breathed. "This place is amazing!" The figure chuckled, stepping into the light. He was a tall, lanky man, with wild gray hair and a pair of goggles perched on his forehead. "Why, thank you, my dear. I do try to keep things interesting." Dax set Treya down on a nearby workbench, keeping a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Treya, meet Dr. Elias Quint, mad scientist extraordinaire and occasional pain in my ass." Dr. Quint clutched at his chest in mock offense. "You wound me, Dax, and here I thought we were friends." "We are friends, Doc, but that doesn't make you any less of a mad bastard." The doctor grinned, his teeth flashing in the dim light. "I'll take that as a compliment." He turned his attention to Treya, his eyes sparkling with curiosity. "Now, who might you be, little one?" Treya straightened her spine, lifting her chin in defiance. "I'm Treya, and I'm not little. I'm 12 cycles old." Dr. Quint's eyebrows shot up, disappearing beneath his hairline. 12 cycles, you say? My, you're practically ancient." Dax cleared his throat, drawing the doctor's gaze. "Listen, Doc, we need your help. Treya here, she's in a bit of a bind. She needs legs, and I know you're the only one who can make it happen." The doctor's expression turned serious, his eyes flickering down to Treya's lower half. "I see. Well, you've certainly come to the right place, but I must warn you the process will not be easy, or painless." Treya's grip tightened on the edge of the workbench, her knuckles turning pale. "I can handle it. I'm tough." Dr. Quinn smiled, but there was a sadness to it. "Of that, I have no doubt. But creating functional prosthetics is no small feat. It will require time, patience, and no small amount of discomfort." Dax rested a hand on Treya's shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "We'll do whatever it takes, Doc. Just tell us what you need." And so began the long and arduous process of crafting Treya's new legs. Dr. Quint worked tirelessly, his hands a blur of motion as he soldered and stitched, wires and metal fusing together in a dance of scientific precision. Treya endured it all with a stoicism that belied her years, gritting her teeth through the pain and discomfort. Dax never left her side, holding her hand and whispering words of encouragement when the going got tough. But as the days turned into weeks, the strain began to show. Treya grew quiet and withdrawn, her eyes haunted by memories she couldn't quite shake. Dax, too, felt the weight of their situation, the knowledge that every moment they spent in the doctor's lab was a moment the Crimson Fangs grew closer to finding them. Late one night, as Treya lay sleeping on a cot in the corner, Dax found himself pacing the length of the lab, his mind churning with doubts and fears. And Dr. Quint watched him from his workbench, his eyes knowing. "You're worried about her, aren't you?" the doctor asked, his voice soft. Dax paused in his pacing, running a hand through his hair. "Of course I am. She's just a kid, Doc. She shouldn't have to go through this." "No, she shouldn't, but life rarely cares about what we think is fair." Dr. Quint set down his tools, turning to face Dax fully. "You know, when you first brought her to me, I thought you'd lost your mind. The Dax I knew was a lone wolf, a man who didn't let anyone get close. But seeing you with her, the way you care for her, it's changed you." Dax shook his head, a rueful smile tugging at his lips. "I don't know about that, Doc. I'm still the same old bastard I've always been." "Perhaps, but even bastards can learn to love." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Dax glanced over at Treya's sleeping form, her face peaceful in the dim light. "She's special, Doc. I don't know why, but I feel like I need to protect her, like it's my job to keep her safe." Dr. Quint nodded, a knowing glint in his eye. "Then that's exactly what you'll do, and I'll be here to help in whatever way I can." Dax clasped the doctor's shoulder, a silent thank you passing between them. They both knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with danger, but they also knew that they would face it together, bound by a friendship that had been forged in the fires of adversity. And as the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, Dax felt a flicker of hope ignite in his chest. They would make it through this, him and Treya. They would find a way to keep her safe, to give her the life she deserved. No matter what it took. The sound of shattering glass jolted Dax from his restless sleep, his hand instinctively reaching for the blaster at his hip. Beside him, Treya sat bolt upright, her eyes wide with fear. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Dax pressed a finger to his lips, motioning for her to stay quiet. He crept toward the door of the small room they'd been sleeping in, his heart pounding in his chest. From beyond the door came the sound of muffled voices and heavy footsteps, growing louder with each passing second. Dax cursed under his breath, recognizing the telltale signs of an impending attack. He turned to Treya, his expression grim. "It's the Crimson Fangs. They found us." Treya's face paled, her hands gripping the edge of the cot. "What do we do?" Dax's mind raced, calculating their options. They were outnumbered and outgunned, trapped in a labyrinth of a building with no easy escape route. But he'd be damned if he let the Fangs take Treya without a fight. "We fight," he said, his voice steady, "and we run like hell." He crossed the room in 2 quick strides, kneeling down to look Treya in the eye. "Listen to me, kid. I know you're scared, but I need you to be brave. I need you to do exactly what I say when I say it. Can you do that for me?" Treya nodded, a flicker of determination sparking in her eyes. "I can do it." Dax smiled, a fierce pride welling up in his chest. "That's my girl." He reached into his boot, pulling out a small, wicked-looking knife. "Take this. If anyone gets too close, you stick him with the pointy end." Treya took the knife, her hand trembling only slightly as she gripped the hilt. "I've never hurt anyone before. I know, and I hope you never have to. But if it comes down to it, you do what you have to do to survive. Understand?" She nodded, her jaw set in a stubborn line. "I understand." Dax stood, unholstering his blaster. "Good. Now stay close to me and be ready to run when I give the word." Together they crept out of the room, hugging the walls as they made their way towards the heart of the lab. The sounds of fighting grew louder, the clash of metal on metal and the sizzle of blaster fire echoing through the halls. They rounded a corner, and Dax's heart sank. The lab was in chaos, overturned tables and shattered equipment littering the floor. In the center of the room stood Dr. Quint, a smoking blaster in his hand and a fierce snarl on his face. Surrounding him were a dozen Crimson Fangs, their red armor glinting in the flickering light. They advanced on the doctor, their weapons drawn and their eyes glinting with malice. Dax didn't hesitate. He raised his blaster, firing off a volley of shots that sent the Fangs scattering for cover. He grabbed Treya's hand, pulling her towards the doctor. "Doc, we gotta go!" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the din of battle. Dr. Quint nodded, his face grim. "The legs aren't finished, Dax. We need more time." Dax shook his head, his grip tightening on Treya's hand. "We don't have time, Doc. It's now or never." The doctor hesitated, his eyes flickering to Treya's face. She met his gaze, her chin lifted in defiance. "I can do it," she said, her voice steady. "I can fight." Dr. Quint's expression softened, a flicker of pride crossing his face. "Of course you can, my dear. You're the bravest little warrior I've ever met." He turned to Dax, his eyes hardening with resolve. "Get her out of here, Dax. I'll hold them off as long as I can." Dax opened his mouth to protest, but the doctor cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Go, damn it, before it's too late." With a final anguished look, Dax turned and ran, Treya clinging to his back like a lifeline. They raced through the twisting corridors of the lab, the sounds of battle fading behind them. They burst out into the street, the cold night air stinging their lungs. Dax didn't slow, his feet pounding against the pavement as he ran. Treya's arms wrapped tight around his neck. Behind them, the lab exploded in a ball of fire, the force of the blast knocking them to the ground. Dax rolled, shielding Treya with his body as debris rained down around them. When the dust settled, he sat up, his ears ringing and his vision blurred. Beside him, Treya stirred, her face streaked with soot and tears. "Dr. Quint," she whispered, her voice breaking. Dax gathered her into his arms, holding her close as she wept. "I know, kid, I know, but we have to keep moving. We have to stay alive for his sake." Treya nodded, her small body shuddering with grief. Dax stood, lifting her onto his back once more. They set off into the night, their hearts heavy with loss and their minds racing with questions. Where would they go now? How would they stay ahead of the Crimson Fangs? And most importantly, how would Dax keep his promise to protect Treya, now that they were truly on their own? As the city lights faded behind them, Dax felt a grim determination settle over him. He would find a way, no matter what it took. He would keep Treya safe even if it meant facing down an entire army of Fangs, even if it meant sacrificing everything he had left. The abandoned warehouse was cold and damp, the air thick with the stench of mold and decay. Dax had found it on the outskirts of the city, a forgotten relic of a bygone era when industry had thrived on this forsaken planet. It wasn't much, but it was a roof over their heads and a place to lay low while they licked their wounds and planned their next move. Treya sat on a pile of old crates, her legs dangling over the edge as she watched Dax pace the length of the warehouse floor. He'd been on edge ever since they'd escaped the lab, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows for any sign of danger. "Dax," she said, her voice soft, "what are we going to do now?" He stopped pacing, his shoulders slumping as he turned to face her. "I don't know, kid. I'm making this up as I go along." Treya nodded, her face solemn. "I miss Dr. Quint." Dax felt a pang of grief twist in his chest. "Me too, kid. Me too. But he wouldn't want us to give up. He'd want us to keep fighting, to make sure his sacrifice wasn't in vain." Treya's eyes hardened, a flicker of determination sparking in their depths. "Then that's what we'll do. We'll fight." Dax couldn't help but smile, a fierce pride welling up in his heart. This kid was something else, tough as nails and brave as a lion. She reminded him of himself at that age, before the war had beaten the idealism out of him. "Damn straight, we'll fight. But first, we need to get you ready." Treya cocked her head, curiosity glinting in her eyes. "Ready for what?" Dax crossed the room, kneeling down to look her in the eye. "For whatever comes next, the Crimson Fangs aren't going to stop looking for us, and we need to be prepared. I'm going to teach you how to defend yourself, how to fight back if anyone tries to hurt you." Treya's eyes widened, a flicker of fear crossing her face. "But I've never fought anyone before. What if I'm not strong enough?" Dax reached out, resting a hand on her shoulder. "You are strong enough, Treya, stronger than you know, and I'll be right there with you every step of the way. We're in this together, remember?" She nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Together. And so began Treya's training, a grueling regimen of physical conditioning and combat drills that pushed her to the limits of her endurance. Dax was a strict taskmaster, demanding nothing less than her best effort at all times. But he was also patient, taking the time to explain each move and technique in detail, his hands gentle as he guided her through the motions. Treya was a quick study, her natural agility and keen mind making up for her lack of experience. As the days turned into weeks, Treya grew stronger, her body hardening with lean muscle and her reflexes sharpening to a razor's edge. She learned how to throw a punch, how to dodge a blow, how to use an opponent's size and strength against them. But more than that, she learned to trust herself, to believe in her own power and resilience. Dax watched her blossom before his eyes, a fierce pride mingling with a growing sense of unease in his heart. He knew he was getting too attached, too invested in this little alien girl who had somehow wormed her way into his life. He'd always been a loner, a man who kept his distance from others to avoid the inevitable pain of loss. But with Treya, he couldn't help himself. She was like a beacon of light in the darkness, a reminder of all the things he'd once fought for and believed in. She made him want to be better, to be the kind of man who could keep her safe and give her the life she deserved. And that terrified him, because he knew all too well how quickly the universe could snatch away the things you loved most. One evening, As they sat huddled around a small fire, Treya looked up at him, her eyes glinting with a strange intensity. "Dax," she said, her voice hesitant, "can I ask you something?" He nodded, his heart clenching at the vulnerability in her tone. "Of course, kid. Anything?" She took a deep breath, her small hands twisting in her lap. Do you think we'll ever find a place where we can be safe? Where we don't have to keep running and fighting all the time?" Dax felt a lump form in his throat, his chest aching with a longing he couldn't quite name. He wanted to tell her yes, to promise her a future free from fear and pain. But he knew better than to make promises he couldn't keep. "I don't know, Treya," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I do know that as long as we stick together, as long as we have each other's backs, we can face anything this universe throws at us. And maybe, just maybe, we'll find that place someday. A place to call home." Treya smiled, a soft, hopeful thing that made Dax's heart skip a beat. She scooted closer to him, resting her head on his shoulder as she stared into the flickering flames. "I think I've already found my home," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. "It's with you, Dax. Wherever you are, that's where I belong." Dax felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling of belonging and purpose that he'd never known before. He wrapped an arm around Treya's shoulders, holding her close as the night closed in around them. And for a moment, just a moment, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to make this work, to build a life together, a family forged in the fires of adversity and tempered by the unbreakable bonds of love. It was a fragile hope, a flickering flame in the darkness, but it was enough to keep them going, to give them the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together. The first time it happened, Dax thought he was seeing things. They were in the middle of a sparring session, Treya's face flushed with exertion as she dodged and weaved around his attacks. She was getting better every day, her movements growing more fluid and confident with each passing hour. But then just as Dax was about to land a blow, Treya's eyes flashed a brilliant silver, and she seemed to disappear, only to reappear behind him a split second later. Dax whirled around, his heart pounding in his chest, but Treya just grinned at him, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "How did you do that?" he asked, his voice hoarse with shock. Treya shrugged, a hint of uncertainty creeping into her expression. "I don't know. It just sort of happened." Dax frowned, a sense of unease prickling at the back of his neck. He'd seen a lot of strange things in his time, but this was something else entirely. He'd heard rumors of people with special abilities, of course. The Crimson Fangs were always on the lookout for new recruits with unique talents, but he'd never actually seen it for himself. Until now. Over the next few days, Treya's abilities began to manifest more frequently. She could move objects with her mind, create shimmering force fields that deflected blaster bolts, and even heal minor wounds with a touch of her hand. At first, Dax was amazed, marveling at the incredible power that lay dormant within his young charge. But as the days wore on, he began to feel a growing sense of unease, a nagging doubt that whispered in the back of his mind. What if Treya's powers made her a target? What if the Crimson Fangs found out about her abilities and came after her with everything they had? He knew firsthand the lengths they would go to acquire new talent, the brutality they were capable of in pursuit of their goals. And then there was the question of Treya herself. How would these powers change her? Would they corrupt her, twist her into something unrecognizable? He'd seen it happen before, seen good people seduced by the lure of power and the promise of control. He couldn't let that happen to Treya. He wouldn't. One evening, as they sat around the fire, Dax finally broached the subject. "Treya," he said, his voice soft but firm, "we need to talk about your abilities." Treya looked up at him, her eyes wide and uncertain. "What about them?" Dax sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm worried about what they might mean for you, for us, if the wrong people find out about what you can do." He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Treya was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames. "I'm scared too," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. "I don't know what's happening to me, Dax. I don't know how to control it." Dax's heart clenched at the fear in her voice, the vulnerability that lay just beneath the surface. He reached out, taking her small hand in his own. "We'll figure it out together," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I promise. But you have to be careful, Treya. You can't let anyone else see what you can do. Not until we know more." Treya nodded, her grip tightening on his hand. "I'll try, but what if I can't control it? What if I hurt someone by accident?" Dax swallowed hard, his mind racing with possibilities. He knew the dangers of unchecked power, the destruction it could cause in the wrong hands. But he also knew that Treya was one of the kindest, most compassionate people he'd ever met. She would never intentionally harm another living being. "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it," he said, trying to inject a note of confidence into his voice. "For now, we focus on your training. We make sure you're as prepared as you can be, both physically and mentally." Treya nodded, a flicker of determination sparking in her eyes. "I won't let you down, Dax. I promise." Dax smiled, a fierce pride welling up in his chest. "I know you won't, kid. You're the strongest person I know." As the night wore on, Dax's mind churned with questions and doubts. He knew that Treya's abilities were a double-edged sword, a gift that could be used for good or for ill, and he knew that it was up to him to guide her, to help her navigate the treacherous waters of her own power. But he also knew that he would do whatever it took to keep her safe, to protect her from those who would seek to exploit her for their own gain. Even if it meant facing down an army of crimson fangs, even if it meant sacrificing his own life. Because Treya was more than just his charge, more than just a kid he'd taken under his wing. She was his family, the only thing in this universe that mattered to him anymore, and he would be damned if he let anyone take that away from him. The ambush came out of nowhere, a blur of red armor and flashing blades that sent Dax and Treya scrambling for cover. They'd been out scavenging for supplies, picking through the ruins of an old factory on the outskirts of the city when the Crimson Fangs had descended upon them like a pack of hungry wolves. Dax cursed himself for letting his guard down, for not sensing the danger until it was too late. He'd grown complacent in the weeks since they'd gone into hiding, lulled into a false sense of security by the relative peace and quiet of their new life. But now, as he crouched behind a crumbling wall, his blaster clutched tightly in his hand, he realized just how foolish he'd been. The Fangs were relentless, their attacks coming from all sides in a dizzying barrage of laser fire and sharpened steel. Beside him, Treya was trembling, her eyes wide with fear as she pressed herself against the wall. Dax could see the terror in her face, the knowledge that they were hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned. But there was something else there too. A flicker of determination that sparked in her silver eyes. She looked up at him, her jaw set in a stubborn line. "Dax," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos raging around them. "I think I can help." Dax shook his head, his grip tightening on his blaster. "No way, kid. You're not ready for this. Just stay down and let me handle it." But Treya was already moving, her small body shimmering with a faint blue light as she stepped out from behind the wall. Dax's heart leapt into his throat as he saw the Fangs turn towards her, their weapons raised and ready to fire. And then, something incredible happened. Treya's eyes flashed a brilliant silver, and a shimmering force field sprang up around her, deflecting the incoming blaster bolts like raindrops off a windshield. She raised her hands and the Fangs were lifted off their feet, their bodies twisting and contorting in midair as if caught in an invisible vice. Dax watched in awe as Treya moved through the battlefield like a force of nature, her powers growing stronger and more focused with each passing moment. She was a blur of blue skin and white hair, a whirlwind of energy that sent the Fangs flying in all directions. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The Fangs lay scattered across the factory floor, their armor dented and their weapons shattered. Treya stood in the center of the carnage, her chest heaving with exertion and her eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. Dax scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest as he raced toward her. "Treya!" he cried, his voice hoarse with fear and relief. "Are you okay?" She turned towards him, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I'm fine, Dax. Better than fine, actually." Dax shook his head in disbelief, his mind reeling with the implications of what he'd just witnessed. "How did you do that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Treya shrugged, a hint of uncertainty creeping into her expression. "I don't know. It just sort of came to me. Like I'd always known how to do it, but I just needed the right moment to let it out." Dax nodded, a sense of pride and wonder welling up in his chest. He'd always known that Treya was special, that there was something unique and powerful about her. But seeing her in action, watching her take on an entire squad of Crimson Fangs and emerge victorious, it was beyond anything he could have imagined. But even as he marveled at her incredible abilities, Dax couldn't shake the sense of unease that prickled at the back of his neck. He knew that Treya's powers were a double-edged sword, a gift that could be used for good or for ill, And he knew that the Fangs would stop at nothing to possess that power for themselves. They needed to be more careful, more vigilant. They needed to find a way to harness Treya's abilities, to train her to use them in a way that wouldn't draw unwanted attention or put her in danger. But for now, as they picked their way through the ruins of the factory, Dax couldn't help but feel a sense of hope and possibility. With Treya by his side, he knew that they could face anything this universe threw at them. Together, they were unstoppable. The news of Treya's abilities spread like wildfire through the city's underworld, a whispered legend that grew more fantastical with each retelling. Some said she was a goddess in disguise, a divine being sent to bring justice to the downtrodden and oppressed. Others claimed she was a demon, a creature of pure chaos and destruction that would stop at nothing to achieve her goals. But to the Crimson Fangs, she was something else entirely. She was a prize to be won, a weapon to be wielded in their endless quest for power and control, and they would stop at nothing to possess her. Dax knew they were coming, could feel the noose tightening around their necks with each passing day. They'd stayed on the move since the ambush at the factory, never staying in one place for more than a night or two. But it wasn't enough. The Fangs were always one step behind them, their spies and informants lurking in every shadow and alleyway. They needed help, needed somewhere to hide until they could figure out their next move. But in a city where loyalty was bought and sold like any other commodity, trust was a rare and precious thing. And then just when all hope seemed lost, they found themselves in the most unlikely of places. It was a bar, a seedy little hole in the wall tucked away in the heart of the city's most dangerous district. Dax had been there before, back in his military days, when he'd needed information or a quick drink to dull the pain of his latest mission. It was a place where the desperate and the destitute mingled with the criminals and the corrupt, where secrets were currency and violence was a way of life. But it was also a place where the Crimson Fangs held no sway, where even their most ruthless enforcers feared to tread. And that made it the perfect hideout for two fugitives on the run. They slipped in through the back door, Dax's arm wrapped protectively around Treya's shoulders as they made their way through the crowded room. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of stale beer, the walls vibrating with the pounding beat of some alien music. At the bar, a group of rough-looking mercenaries eyed them warily, their hands hovering near their weapons as Dax approached. He knew better than to show any weakness in a place like this, knew that even the slightest hint of vulnerability could be an invitation to trouble. But before he could say a word, a voice cut through the din, a low, gravelly rumble that sent a shiver down his spine. Well, 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 if it isn't Dax the Axe in the flesh? Dax turned slowly, his hand instinctively reaching for his blaster. But when he saw the speaker, he felt a rush of relief so strong it nearly brought him to his knees. It was Grim, his old squad mate from his military days. They'd served together on a dozen different campaigns, had each other's backs through thick and thin. Grim was a born fighter, a man who'd seen the worst the universe had to offer and come out the other side stronger for it. And right now, he was the most beautiful sight Dax had ever seen. Grim, Dax said, his voice hoarse with emotion. I never thought I'd see you again. Grim grinned, his teeth flashing white in the dim light of the bar. Likewise, brother. Heard you got yourself into a bit of trouble with the Fangs. Dax nodded, his grip tightening on Treya's shoulder. You could say that. We need a place to lay low, just for a little while. Grim's eyes flicked to Treya, a flicker of curiosity sparking in their depths. And who's this little lady? Treya straightened her spine, her chin lifting in defiance. I'm Treya, and I'm not a little lady. I'm 12 cycles old. Grim chuckled, a low rumbling sound that seemed to fill the room. My apologies, Treya. Didn't mean to offend. He turned back to Dax, his expression growing serious. Listen, Dax, I've got a place you can stay, a safe house on the outskirts of the city. It's not much, but it's off the grid and away from prying eyes. You can hole up there until the heat dies down. Dax felt a rush of gratitude so strong it nearly brought tears to his eyes. I don't know how to thank you, Grim. Grim waved a hand dismissively. Don't mention it. You do the same for me. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. But listen, Dax, the Fangs aren't the only ones interested in your little friend here. There's talk of other factions, powerful people who'd love to get their hands on someone with her abilities. You need to watch your back, now more than ever. Dax nodded, a sense of grim determination settling over him. He'd known that Treya's powers would attract attention, had tried to prepare himself for the inevitable fallout. But hearing it from Grim, a man he trusted with his life, made it all seem so much more real. They needed to be careful, needed to stay one step ahead of the game. But with Grimm's help and Treya's incredible abilities, Dax knew that they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together, they were a force to be reckoned with. The safe house was a nondescript little building on the outskirts of the city, its walls a dull, featureless gray that seemed to blend into the surrounding landscape. Inside, it was sparsely furnished, but clean, with a small kitchen, a couple of bedrooms, and a living area that doubled as a makeshift training room. It was here that Dax and Treya met with Grimm and his network of rebel fighters, a ragtag group of mercenaries, smugglers, and former soldiers who had banded together to fight against the Crimson Fangs and their iron-fisted rule over the city. They were a rough-and-tumble bunch, with scars and tattoos and eyes that had seen too much. But they were also fiercely loyal and deeply committed to their cause, willing to risk everything for a chance at a better life. Grimm introduced them, one by one, his voice gruff but proud as he rattled off their names and specialties. There was Asha, a fierce-looking woman with a shaved head and a cybernetic arm, who could hack into any computer system in the galaxy, and Rafe, a wiry little man with a quick smile and quicker fingers, who could pick any lock and steal any treasure. But it was the last member of the group who caught Dax's eye, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a shock of red hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. His name was Cade, and he had the bearing of a soldier, with a quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from every pore. Grimm clapped him on the shoulder, a grin splitting his weathered face. "Cade here is our resident demolitions expert. If it explodes, he knows how to make it bigger and better." Cade nodded, his eyes flicking to Treya with a curious intensity. "I hear you've got some special skills of your own, little lady." Treya bristled, her chin lifting in defiance. "I'm not a little lady, and my skills are none of your business." Cade chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to fill the room. "Fair enough, but if we're going to be working together, we need to know what everyone brings to the table." Dax stepped forward, his hand coming to rest on Treya's shoulder. Treya's abilities are her own. She'll use them as she sees fit, and not a moment before. Cade held up his hands in a placating gesture, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "No offense meant, Dax, just trying to get a sense of the lay of the land." Grimm cleared his throat, his expression growing serious. "Listen up, everyone. We've got a real chance here to make a difference, to strike a blow against the Fangs and everything they stand for. But we need to be smart about it, need to play the long game." He turned to Dax, his eyes boring into him with a fierce intensity. "Dax, I know you're used to working alone, but if we're going to pull this off, we need to be a team. Can you handle that?" Dax hesitated, his mind whirling with doubts and uncertainties. He'd been a lone wolf for so long, had gotten used to relying on no one but himself. But looking around at the faces of these rebels, at the hope and determination that shone in their eyes, he knew that he couldn't turn his back on them, not when they needed him the most. He nodded, his jaw set in a stubborn line. "I'm in, Grimm. Whatever it takes." Grimm grinned, his teeth flashing white in the dim light of the safe house. "Glad to hear it, brother, because we've got our work cut out for us." Over the next few weeks, Dax and Treya threw themselves into their training with a newfound intensity. They sparred with the other rebels, learning new techniques and honing their skills until they moved like a well-oiled machine. But it was Treya's powers that truly set them apart, her abilities growing stronger and more focused with each passing day. Under Cade's guidance, she learned to harness her telekinesis with pinpoint precision, lifting and hurling objects with a flick of her wrist. And with Asha's help, she delved deeper into the mysteries of her own mind, unlocking new abilities that left even Dax in awe. But as they grew stronger, so too did the Crimson Fangs. Their spies were everywhere, their influence spreading like a cancer through the city's underworld. And with each passing day, the noose around the rebels' necks grew tighter and tighter. They needed to act, needed to strike a decisive blow against the Fangs before it was too late. And so, with Grimm's blessing, they began to plan their most daring mission yet. It was a risky gambit, a last-ditch effort to cripple the Fangs' operations and send a message to the people of the city that they were not alone, that there was still hope for a better tomorrow. But as Dax looked around at the faces of his fellow rebels, at the fire that burned in their eyes and the steel in their spines, he knew that they would stop at nothing to see it through. They were a family now, bound together by a shared purpose and an unbreakable bond. And with Treya by his side, Dax knew that they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together they would fight, together they would win, or die trying. The final battle was a blur of chaos and destruction, a whirlwind of blaster fire and explosions that seemed to shake the very foundations of the city. Dax and Treya fought side by side, their movements perfectly synchronized as they tore through the ranks of the Crimson Fangs, like a hot knife through butter. But even with all their skill and all their power, they were still outnumbered and outgunned. The Fangs were relentless, their attacks coming from all sides in a never-ending barrage of violence and death. And then, in a moment that would be forever etched into Dax's memory, the leader of the Fangs himself stepped onto the battlefield. He was a massive brute of a man, with arms like tree trunks and a face that looked like it had been carved from solid rock. In his hand, he held a crackling energy whip, its tendrils writhing and snapping like angry snakes. He fixed his gaze on Treya, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "So this is the little girl who's been causing me so much trouble. I have to admit, I'm impressed, but your luck has just run out." Dax stepped forward, his blaster leveled at the Fang leader's chest. "You're not touching her, you son of a bitch. Not while I'm still breathing." The leader laughed, a cold, merciless sound that sent shivers down Dax's spine. "Oh, I'm counting on it." What happened next was a blur of motion and pain, a dance of death that seemed to stretch on for an eternity. Dax and the Fang leader clashed in a flurry of blows, their weapons flashing and sparking as they fought for dominance. But the leader was too strong, too fast. With a brutal backhand, he sent Dax flying across the battlefield, his body slamming into a crumbling wall with a sickening crunch. Through the haze of pain, Dax saw the leader advancing on Treya, his energy whip crackling with deadly intent. He tried to rise, tried to force his battered body to move, but it was no use, and he was too weak, too broken. And then, just as the leader raised his whip for the killing blow, Treya's eyes flashed with a brilliant silver light. She raised her hands, and the very air around her seemed to ripple and warp, as if reality itself was bending to her will. The leader's whip froze in midair, its tendrils quivering and straining against an invisible force. Treya's face was a mask of concentration, her brow furrowed with the effort of holding the weapon at bay. But even as Dax watched in awe, he saw the leader's other hand reaching for his blaster, saw the cruel glint in his eye as he prepared to end Treya's life with a single shot. And in that moment, Dax knew what he had to do. With a roar of defiance, he launched himself at the leader, his body moving with a speed and strength he didn't know he possessed. He slammed into the Fang with the force of a raging bull, sending them both tumbling to the ground in a tangle of limbs and weapons. The leader's blaster went flying, skittering across the ground in a shower of sparks. Dax grappled with the Fang, his hands seeking purchase on the man's thick neck, his fingers digging into the flesh with a desperate animal fury. But the leader was too strong, his muscles bulging with a savage power that Dax couldn't hope to match. With a brutal twist, he broke Dax's grip, his hands closing around Dax's throat in a vice-like grip. Dax gasped for air, his vision swimming with black spots as he felt the life being squeezed out of him. He clawed at the leader's hands, his nails leaving bloody furrows in the man's skin, but it was no use. And then, just as the darkness was about to claim him, he heard Treya's voice, a desperate, anguished cry that pierced through the fog of his fading consciousness. "Dax!" There was a blinding flash of silver light, and suddenly the pressure on Dax's throat was gone. He fell to the ground, gasping and coughing as he struggled to draw breath into his burning lungs. Through the tears that streamed down his face, he saw Treya standing over the Fang leader's body, her eyes blazing with a fierce, unearthly light. The man lay still and unmoving, his neck twisted at an impossible angle, his eyes staring sightlessly at the sky. Treya turned to Dax, her face a mask of fear and concern. She knelt beside him, her small hands cradling his face with a gentleness that broke his heart. "Dax, please stay with me. Don't leave me alone." Dax tried to speak, tried to tell her that he would never leave her, that he would always be there for her. But the words wouldn't come, his throat too raw and bruised to form the sounds. And then, as he felt the last of his strength fading away, he saw Treya's eyes flash with a sudden desperate intensity. She placed her hands on his chest, her fingers splayed over his heart, and closed her eyes in concentration. Dax felt a warmth spreading through his body, a tingling, electric sensation that seemed to flow from Treya's hands and into his very bones. He gasped as he felt his wounds knitting together, the pain and fatigue melting away like snow in the sun. And then, with a shuddering breath, he opened his eyes, his gaze locking with Treya's in a moment of perfect understanding. They had won. The Crimson Fangs were defeated, their leader dead at their feet. But more than that, they had found something that they had both been searching for their entire lives. A family. Dax sat up, his arms wrapping around Treya in a fierce, protective embrace. She clung to him, her small body shaking with sobs of relief and joy. "I thought I lost you," she whispered, her voice muffled against his chest. Dax stroked her hair, his own eyes stinging with tears. "You'll never lose me, kid. I'm not going anywhere." They stayed like that for a long moment, holding each other as the sounds of battle faded away around them. And then with a deep, shuddering breath, Dax pulled back, his hands coming up to cup Treya's face. "Treya, I know I'm not your real father, but I want you to know that I love you like you were my own daughter. And if you'll have me, I want to make it official. I want to adopt you, to give you the family you've always deserved." Treya's eyes widened, her lips trembling with emotion, and then with a cry of pure, unbridled joy, she threw her arms around Dax's neck, her tears soaking into his shirt. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with happiness. "Yes, yes, yes. I love you too, Dad." And there, amidst the rubble and the ruin of the battlefield, Dax and Treya held each other close, their hearts beating as one. They had been through hell and back, had faced down the worst the universe had to offer. But they had emerged stronger, their bond forged in the fires of adversity and tempered by the unbreakable power of love. They were a family now in every sense of the word, and together they knew that they could face whatever challenges lay ahead, because they had each other, and that was all they would ever need.